A former prisoner secured a job as a caregiver for a disabled millionaire whose wife had left him. He didn't tell me anything about it because he didn't want to upset you, Sandra sighed. Everyone was focused on Francisca's project, leaving no one to manage the rest of the business. As a result, you're behind on 2 major projects, and the clients are demanding refunds and damages. Felipe will come today and explain everything. That night, Felipe entered Carlos's room with a sad expression. It was clear things were really bad. Felipe, what's going on? Carlos shouted angrily. You've ruined our company. Please calm down, his vice responded calmly. I'll pay 20% of your company's value. I'm sorry, but with the company's debts being this high, I can't offer you more. As for Francisca, she's willing to work with me. All right, Carlos replied calmly. But under what pretext are you using my project to work with Francisca? This isn't just a copyright violation, Felipe, it's theft. Felipe stood up calmly, took a document out of his briefcase, and handed it to Carlos. Carlos, I'm sorry, but Francisca changed her mind. When you went to the hospital, she asked me to alter the project because she and her husband had a change of heart. But we'd already done so much work to alter the landscape. Carlos couldn't believe it. With their money, they can do anything, Felipe sighed. Today they're digging holes and removing the soil, and tomorrow they're building hills. Carlos began to cry. I've lost everything. That's why I want to help you, Felipe said, embracing him. I'm offering you a good price for your business. Carlos agreed and signed all the documents the next day. A week later, his wife entered his room. Carlos, I'm sorry, but we're leaving, she said calmly. You're a grown man and must realize that I need to feed my children. But I have enough money to support you for 7 years, the man pleaded, begging her to stay. Sandra, I can't live without the children. I beg you, stay. Carlos, you're selfish, Sandra shouted. Think about our children. You already have someone. Carlos's eyes filled with tears. I'm asking you, answer me. Did you really think I would stay here for the rest of my life, rotting away with you? She replied. Look at you. When you weren't disabled and had money, everything was fine for you. Carlos, furious, shouted, Get out of here. You're nothing but a miserable, corrupt person. From that day on, it seemed like something inside Carlos broke. He became bitter and resentful, constantly yelling at the house staff. Those who had worked for him for a long time couldn't understand what was happening. I hate this, the owner shouted late at night in his bed. I hate all of you. If you had any pity for me, I'd beg you to stop all this. But it seemed like the heavens didn't hear him, and each day, the pain grew. Carlos didn't know how to cope and took out all his anger on the few remaining employees. What is this? He asked the cook furiously. I won't eat this. Do you think just because I'm disabled, I've become a pig? He shouted at the top of his lungs, furiously throwing the plate off the table and rolling his wheelchair to his office. He began to toss his documents, projects, and books onto the floor. Hate. I hate all of you. I hate this house. I hate myself, he screamed furiously multiple times. Carlos thought about doing something terrible to himself, but there was a force within him that wouldn't let him give up. The pain was so unbearable that he thought he was going insane. About a month passed, and the people who worked for him were gradually dismissed, leaving only an old gardener. The gardener patted his master's head. You're a good person. There's no evil inside you. What happened was terrible, but life will certainly show you a way out. Like any genius, you're a hypersensitive person. But if you look at things differently, everything will change. Meanwhile, a little farther away, Christiane was packing her bag with trembling hands. She had imagined this day so many times, the day when the prison gates would open before her and she would finally be free. However, when that day came, all Christiane felt were intense emotions and a shiver running through her body. The woman walked out of her cell, separated by several doors from her new life. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest as the prison gates closed behind her. She hesitated for a moment, then clenched her fists and walked quickly forward. I will never return here, she repeated in her mind. God, do you hear me? Never. Christiane had spent her entire life with her grandparents in a small village. She met her fiancé, Caio, at the age of 20. Her grandfather was still alive then, but within a year of their marriage, he passed away. The young couple decided to sell his house. Caio added some money and they bought a beautiful home in a larger nearby town. The first 2 years, Christiane and Caio lived well, but over time, Caio started drinking and going out. Soon, he found himself in a tough situation where he was framed and a large sum of money was demanded from him. Both Caio and Christiane began to think about how they could escape the situation. Caio borrowed a large sum of money from several friends and decided to go to the capital to earn money and pay off the debt as quickly as possible. As Christiane began to feel better, she started to notice the kindness and openness in Carlos, even though he did his best to hide these qualities from others. Mr. Magalhães trimmed the pine tree, and I gathered some branches for a bouquet, Christiane mentioned one day. Oh, bring it here, Carlos requested, intrigued. Christiane brought him a bouquet made of pine branches and white roses and handed it to him. He examined it closely. Why white roses? Carlos asked, curious. Why didn't you include some red ones? I believe that combining pine with white roses creates a bouquet that symbolizes nobility and peace, Christiane explained. Carlos looked at her intently, then shifted his attention back to the bouquet. Christiane, please bring me an album and some watercolors from my desk, he finally said. I want to paint it. An hour later, Christiane was looking over the sketches. One depicted a pine tree adorned with white roses, while another showed towering rocks resembling cliffs, with white roses creeping over them. The roses didn't completely cover the rocks, but their buds spread across much of the space. It's very beautiful, the woman exclaimed, unable to contain her admiration. Now I can clearly see what you wanted to convey. You have a great sense of the essence and meaning of things. Carlos initially smiled, but then, as if suddenly awakening, snatched the drawings from Christiane's hands in anger and tore them up. It's all nonsense, he shouted, furious. Take your stuff and leave me alone. He quickly turned his wheelchair around and headed back to his room. The housekeeper gathered the torn drawings. She felt hurt by Carlos's behavior, but pitied him even more. She had heard from Mr. Magalhães on several occasions that Carlos had real talent, but he rejected any attempt to reclaim his former self. Christiane worked for her new employer every day except Sundays. It took almost a week to organize the house, but now everything was easier. She even had some free time and began helping the gardener. Almost a month passed, and Carlos still spoke to Christiane curtly and only about work-related matters. Then one day, Carlos approached her. Christiane, would you mind accompanying me on my walk? He asked coldly. I'd like to stroll down the street. All right, the housekeeper responded. I'll just take off my apron. They walked in silence along the deserted street. Suddenly, Christiane heard the sound of someone crying. Is that a bird crying? The woman asked aloud, or maybe it's a cat meowing. Wait a minute, I'll check it out. Christiane reached the bushes and saw a puppy stuck in the fence. After about 5 minutes, she finally managed to free him. The dog wagged its tail happily and ran toward its savior. Hey, buddy, are you going to follow us now? Carlos asked. Where's your home? He seems to have no home, Christiane replied, concern evident in her voice as she looked hopefully at Carlos. Shouldn't we take him home then? The man was about to say no, but to his surprise, he hesitated. Why not? Maybe he can learn to fetch my slippers for me. Carlos's smile transformed him, and Christiane was breathless with joy. It was the first time she had seen his true face. On the way back, they eagerly discussed what to name their pet and what to do with him next. Rex is a real troublemaker, the gardener grumbled the next morning. He dug up all my strawberry plants. I think Rex will cause us a lot of problems. He probably thinks he's the boss now, Christiane sighed. She had just entered the house to greet Carlos, but he was not in a good mood that morning. What's wrong with him? She whispered with tears in her eyes. Yesterday, everything was fine. We had a fun walk, saved the dog, and were happy. And today, he's sitting like a dark cloud again. Carlos's mood swings were exhausting for Christiane. Despite everything, Christian liked Carlos very much, and she dreamed of becoming his friend somehow. She wanted to talk to him about many things. She admired what he did, and when she cleaned his office, she often flipped through his sketchbooks. Christian appreciated his projects and ideas. It was as if she could feel what he wanted to convey through his work, and this drew her strongly toward him. Summer ended, and it was September. Christian thought about leaving many times, but whenever she approached Carlos to tell him she was going, something inside her stopped her. She clearly felt that she wanted to stay. One day, Carlos asked her to walk down the street with him again. Rex accompanied them, as usual. "We have to give credit to Mr. Magalhaes," Carlos said. "He turned this unruly puppy into a noble dog." Rex not only grew up, but also obeyed all commands and was always by his master's side. "Well, Rex, today you're taking us for a walk," Carlos added. The image changed drastically. "That's your famous horizontal pine tree," exclaimed Francisca's husband excitedly. "You know, it looks very interesting. If I had seen it separately, it wouldn't have made such an impression on me, but together with the surroundings, it looks simply wonderful." The couple strolled through the garden for an hour and a half, and as they progressed, they spoke less and less. They arrived at the rocks where the white roses were hanging. "This part of the garden looks incredible," Francisca said, closing her eyes to take in the subtle aroma of the roses. Ahead, they saw the surface of a lake and walked toward it. They found a wooden platform with chairs. Francisca and Paulo sat down and closed their eyes, feeling as if they had completely merged with nature. After a while, the wife looked at her husband, tears streaming down his face. The man couldn't stop. He looked at the lake and saw his true reflection in it. "I never thought I could experience something like this, and in a garden," Paulo finally said. "Francisca, now I understand what you meant." They walked back in silence, each wanting to prolong their impressions as much as possible. The couple left the garden and approached Carlos, who had been waiting for them all this time. "Carlos, you're a genius," Francisca declared, overwhelmed with emotion. "It's even better than in my dreams." "Thank you." Paulo shook his hand. "It's very hard to surprise me, but what you've done, I would call a true miracle." "Mr. and Mrs. Fernandez," Carlos spoke after they discussed the garden, "we'd like to leave tomorrow." "But Carlos, don't you want to be present at the official opening?" the garden owner asked, surprised. "I've done my job," Carlos replied calmly. "I don't need fame, recognition, or criticism. Some will appreciate my garden, others will create something even better, and some will criticize it. Now it's time to go back home." And so it was. Many people attended the garden's opening. Some couldn't utter a word and could only sigh, while others analyzed every detail and tried to label everything. "But it's very beautiful," one critic said. "All the rules of garden architecture have been broken." "Rules were made to be broken," another replied. "This is a true sensory garden. You don't come here just to see it. You come here to discover yourself." However, no matter how much Paulo Fernandez's garden was criticized, people loved it. With her husband's consent, Francisca made it accessible to everyone. Visitors from all over the country began to come, and years passed. "Christian, have you seen my latest sketches?" Carlos asked his wife. "Are they the ones we discussed for Mr. Costa?" "Carlos, look on the windowsill," his wife called from another room. "I probably left them there." The man went to the room, found the sketches, and began to reflect. They were now working on a very interesting project. Christian finished her tasks in the kitchen and went out to the patio. "Carlos, let's have tea on the terrace. Mr. Magalhaes is already here, and Rex too," she called to her husband. The woman was already placing the tray of cups and teapots on the table in the middle of the patio when a red car stopped in front of the house. "Hi, you must be from Mr. Costa's office," Christian said, surprised. "I'm here to see Carlos." "I'm his wife," the woman said arrogantly. "Is he home? And by the way, what's the matter? You're quite talkative for a maid," she said angrily. At that moment, Carlos came out of the house, looking very surprised. "What are you doing here?" he asked, astonished. "Carlos, I'm sorry, but you were right," she said playfully. "We need to be together. especially because we have children, and you've realized this after 3 years, haven't you? He smiled. I suppose Felipe left you, didn't he? Sandra became defensive. What does he have to do with this? He has nothing to do with me. Well, I heard you went away with him to some warmer place, Carlos said with a smirk. It was a mistake, and I deeply regret it. The woman lowered her eyes. Carlos, I realized that I only love you, and I'm not just thinking about myself, but also about our children. Did you forget that we have a family? Sandra, meet my wife, Christian, Carlos said calmly, and not just that, but also my friend and business partner. By the way, Rex has a brother and a sister, and I know Lara is not my daughter. Sandra turned pale. She had heard from acquaintances that Carlos had recovered and become wealthy again, but no one had told her that he had remarried and had children. Over time, Felipe had been corrupted by money. He openly dated other women, and after a while, he cut off Sandra's funds. In the end, she was left with almost nothing. Sandra, although you were always against Edelson coming to see me, I'm grateful to you at least for not opposing our communication with my son by phone, Carlos finally said. I fulfill my duty as a father. I've already opened a bank account in Edelson's name, and every month I transfer a certain amount of money there. Additionally, I'll pay for food, clothes, toys, and school supplies, but he'll need to manage with what he has, Carlos continued. You see, Sandra, I'm committed to ensuring that Edelson has everything he needs, but I won't be providing anything extra for you. It's important that he understands the value of what he has and that he doesn't grow up spoiled. Sandra looked down, her face a mixture of shame and regret. I understand, Carlos, she said quietly. I know I made mistakes, and I can see that you've moved on and built a new life. I won't interfere. Carlos nodded, his expression softening slightly. Thank you, Sandra. It's best for everyone if we keep things civil, especially for Edelson's sake. He's the one who matters most in all of this. With that, Sandra turned and walked back to her car, her posture a little more resigned than when she had arrived. As she drove away, Christian came over to Carlos and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. You handled that well, she said softly. I hope so, Carlos replied with a sigh. I just want to do what's right for Edelson. He's been through enough. Christian smiled at him warmly. You're a good father, Carlos. And you're right, what matters now is the future. We've built something beautiful here, and it's important to focus on that. Carlos nodded, feeling a sense of relief. You're right, Christian. We have a lot to look forward to. As they walked back to the terrace to join Mr. Magalhaes and Rex, Carlos felt a renewed sense of purpose. The past, with all its complications and heartaches, was behind him. Now, he was ready to embrace the future, surrounded by the people who truly mattered to him. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the garden that he and Christian had worked so hard to create. It was a place of peace, reflection, and new beginnings, a place where they could continue to grow, both as individuals and as a family. And in that moment, Carlos knew that everything was going to be all right.